November 24th, 1326. In the marketplace of Hereford, England, a crowd of thousands gathers to witness the execution of a man whose name had once stirred fear and power in equal measure. Hugh Despenser the Younger. Once the most influential man in the realm after King Edward II, he now stands broken, pale, and starved, about to meet one of the most gruesome fates in English history. His story is not just of ambition and betrayal. It is a reflection of how power, sexuality, and politics collided in the brutal theater of medieval justice. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into a powerful and well-connected noble family. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was a loyal servant of King Edward I, and his mother, Isabella Beauchamp, was the daughter of the Earl of Warwick. From the very beginning, Hugh's life was surrounded by privilege, influence, and a deep understanding of how power worked in medieval England. He was raised not just as a nobleman, but as someone destined to serve the crown and to benefit richly from it. From a young age, Hugh witnessed how loyalty to the king could be rewarded with land, titles, and proximity to the throne. He was shrewd, observant, and ambitious. His education was not only in the sword or scripture, but in the delicate, dangerous art of court politics. He knew that the true source of power was not brute strength, but access. Access to the king, to secrets, to the levers of authority that others could only dream of. That opportunity came in 1307, when Edward II succeeded his father as king. The new monarch was already infamous for his intense attachments to male favorites, the most notorious being Piers Gaveston. Gaveston's arrogance and monopolization of royal favor caused deep resentment among the nobility. His eventual execution in 1312 by rebellious barons left a vacuum near the king, a vacuum that Hugh Despenser moved quickly to fill. By 1316, Hugh had carefully worked his way into Edward's inner circle. He was appointed Chamberlain of the Household, a position of extreme intimacy that gave him constant access to the king. But Hugh did not rely on charm alone. He secured his political position by marrying Eleanor de Clare, Edward's niece and heiress, to the lucrative lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. Through this marriage, Hugh gained both wealth and a royal connection that made him nearly untouchable. From this point forward, Hugh's ascent was unstoppable. No longer just a nobleman with good lineage, he was now family, a fixture at court, the king's closest confidant. Yet this closeness would come at a terrible price. As Hugh accumulated more land, power, and enemies, his downfall began to right itself. The stage was set for a bloody reckoning, and the first act had just begun. As Hugh Despenser's relationship with King Edward II deepened, so too did his hunger for power. He was no longer satisfied with titles or land acquired through marriage. He wanted more, much more. Using his proximity to the king, Hugh became the most powerful man in the realm, second only to Edward himself. But his ambition knew no restraint. Between 1316 and 1320, Hugh began acquiring vast estates, many of them forcibly taken from fellow nobles, widows, and even his own in-laws. He manipulated the royal courts to claim disputed lands and seized property from those unable to resist his influence. One of his most shameless actions was stripping his own sister-in-law of valuable lands, not out of legal right, but because he could. His enemies multiplied with every act of greed. Nobles who once tolerated the king's favorites began to seethe with resentment. Unlike Gaveston, who had merely basked in the king's affection, Hugh sought to control the entire machinery of government. He interfered in legal disputes, influenced royal appointments, and even dictated financial policy. The court, once a place of shared power, had become a stage dominated by a single actor. But Hugh's reach extended beyond politics and economics. Whispers began to circulate about the nature of his relationship with Edward II. Though both were married, and Hugh had children, chroniclers began to use the word sodomite, a term that in medieval times implied not only a sin against God, but a threat to the natural and social order. In the eyes of many, Hugh's influence over the king was no longer just political. It was corrupting the very soul of the monarchy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the treatment of Queen Isabella. Once a respected royal figure, she found herself increasingly isolated and humiliated. Hugh restricted her access to the king, seized her lands, and even removed her children from her custody. What had begun as a court rivalry turned into a calculated campaign to erase her influence and her dignity. For the nobles of England, it was clear. The kingdom was no longer ruled by a king, but by his favorite. And that favorite was using royal power for personal vengeance and unchecked enrichment. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and in just a few years, they would erupt into a violent storm that neither Hugh nor Edward could escape. Between 1322 and 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger reached the zenith of his power, not alone but alongside his father, Hugh the Elder. Together, they didn't just influence the English crown, they embodied it. Contemporary chroniclers describe the pair as the rulers behind the throne, with the younger Hugh often referred to as king in all but name. The Despensers controlled royal finances, land disputes, court appointments, and the daily access to Edward II. No petition reached the king without passing through Hugh's hands first. For many nobles and clerics, this was no longer a monarchy. It was a dictatorship cloaked in royal robes. Driven by insatiable greed, Hugh exploited his position to seize lands across England and Wales. He used fabricated legal claims, threats, and military force to dispossess rivals. Even widows and minor heirs weren't safe from his ambitions. In one particularly cruel act, he forced a noblewoman to cede her estates while her husband was held in captivity, by order of the king himself. The common people suffered too. Heavy taxes, arbitrary fines, and forced confiscations became the norm. Local lords who tried to resist were accused of treason and imprisoned without trial. A climate of fear spread across the realm, as more and more Englishmen came to see the Despensers not as loyal stewards of the crown, but as tyrants. And yet, despite the hatred they inspired, the Despensers were untouchable. Hugh's grip on Edward II was total. He isolated the king from dissenting voices, controlled his communications, and even influenced military decisions. In a kingdom ruled by personal loyalty, Hugh had become the monarch's sole compass. But the tighter his grip became, the more opposition brewed in silence. Nobles who had once knelt in reluctant obedience began plotting revenge. The queen herself, publicly humiliated, politically exiled, and personally betrayed, was preparing a storm that would shatter the Despensers' world. In their arrogance, Hugh and his father believed themselves secure, but in truth, they had made enemies of nearly every powerful faction in the realm. Their rise had been swift and ruthless. Their fall, when it came, would be even more spectacular and far more brutal. By 1324, the hatred toward Hugh Despenser had reached a boiling point, and no one loathed him more than Queen Isabella. She had once been the daughter of the powerful King of France, a royal bride sent to unite two kingdoms. Now, she found herself sidelined, stripped of lands, and humiliated by her husband's devotion to another man. Hugh's cruelty toward Isabella went far beyond mere courtly rivalry. He confiscated her estates, imprisoned members of her household, and worst of all, took custody of her own children, placing them under the care of his wife. To the proud queen, this was not just political manipulation. It was personal warfare. But Isabella did not remain passive. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty. And there, everything changed. In the French court, she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had recently escaped from the Tower of London after being imprisoned for opposing the dispensers. Now in exile, Mortimer was bitter, brilliant, and dangerous. Together, he and Isabella forged an alliance that would alter the course of English history. Their relationship quickly became both political and intimate. The queen and the rebel, the humiliated wife and the escaped traitor. They shared a common enemy and a singular goal: to destroy Hugh Despenser and overthrow Edward II. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer returned to England, not with a massive army, but with a small force of mercenaries. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for in fury. And more importantly, they did not march alone for long. The English nobility, long abused and disrespected by the dispensers, began defecting en masse to the Queen's cause. The swiftness of their success shocked even Isabella herself. City after city opened their gates. The king's armies melted away. In just weeks, the kingdom that Hugh had ruled through fear began turning against him. Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger fled westward, taking with them what remained of the royal treasury. It was the beginning of the end, a final desperate attempt to escape justice. But the realm they had once controlled now closed in on them like a tightening noose. The hunt had begun. The escape of Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger was doomed from the start. As Isabella and Mortimer advanced with growing support, the king and his favorite fled westward toward Wales, dragging behind them a rapidly dwindling entourage and what was left of the royal treasury. They hoped to regroup, to find safety, perhaps even to raise another army. But England had turned its back on them. Their enemies moved swiftly. Towns that once welcomed the king now closed their gates. Loyal knights deserted. The people, long resentful of Hugh's cruelty and greed, no longer saw a monarch on the run. They saw a fugitive tyrant and his accomplice. Even those once bound by oath to Edward now offered their allegiance to his wife and her new regime. By late October 1326, Hugh the Elder was captured in Bristol. There was no trial. There was no mercy. He was dragged through the streets, still wearing his armor, and publicly hanged. A brutal end to a man who had served the crown for decades. His body was then beheaded, quartered, and thrown to the dogs, a fate reserved for the most reviled traitors. Meanwhile, Edward II and Hugh the Younger continued their frantic escape through the harsh terrain of Wales. For weeks, they evaded capture, hoping in vain that some loyal force would rise to protect them. But no help came. They were alone, abandoned, hunted. In mid-November, they were finally captured near Neath. There was no resistance. The once great king and his all-powerful favorite were now broken men. Edward was taken into custody and transported to Kenilworth Castle, where he would eventually be forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. But Hugh Despenser would not be granted even the illusion of dignity. He knew what was coming. In desperation, he attempted to starve himself, hoping to die before facing the inevitable. But his plan failed. His captors force-fed him, determined to keep him alive, not out of compassion, but to ensure he would face justice, publicly, painfully. The road to Hereford was long, and Hugh made it in chains. He was no longer the elegant nobleman who once dominated the court. Now he was gaunt, filthy, trembling. The crowd that awaited him was not there to mourn. They came to watch. His judgment was coming, and it would be like no other. On the 24th of November, 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger was brought before a hastily assembled tribunal in Hereford. The outcome had already been decided. His judges, Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and a host of nobles he had once robbed, imprisoned, or humiliated, were not interested in fairness. They were here for vengeance, wrapped in the formality of law. The list of charges against him was long and damning: treason, theft, unlawful seizure of lands, manipulation of the king, corruption of royal justice, and, most controversially, sodomitical practices with King Edward II, though the latter accusation was based more on rumor than proof. It carried immense symbolic weight. In the eyes of his enemies, Hugh had not only corrupted the throne politically, he had defiled it morally. To avoid appearing as a mere revenge execution, the tribunal performed the rituals of legal procedure. Witnesses were called, documents were read aloud, but it was all theater. The sentence had been written before Hugh ever entered the chamber. He was found guilty on all counts. But his punishment would go far beyond death. This was not to be a mere hanging. It was to be a message. The most powerful man in the kingdom, after the king himself, was now to be unmade in public, piece by piece, in a spectacle designed to purge the sins of his rise. A ladder was erected in the central square of Hereford. Crowds gathered: nobles, clergy, peasants, thousands of them, packed shoulder to shoulder to witness justice unfold. Hugh was dragged to the scaffold in chains, pale, thin from starvation. His clothes tattered and soiled, he cut a pathetic figure, a far cry from the glittering courtier he had once been. He was forced to climb the ladder so all could see him. A crown of nettles was placed mockingly on his head, a cruel parody of the royal crown he had once seemed to wear, in all but name. Verses from the Bible, condemning pride and sin, were painted onto his skin. Then came the sentence. It would be carried out immediately, and it would be remembered for centuries. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger on November 24, 1326, was not merely a death, it was a ritual. A spectacle of revenge, humiliation, and moral cleansing played out before an enormous crowd in the marketplace of Hereford. The people had not gathered just to see a man die, they came to witness the destruction of a tyrant. Hugh was tied high on a tall wooden ladder, exposed like a trophy, a crown of nettles, sharp and burning, dug into his scalp. Painted on his skin were biblical verses denouncing arrogance and sin, as if to mark him as both blasphemer and traitor. At the base of the scaffold stood Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and many of the barons he had once extorted, now united in grim satisfaction. Then, the true horror began. According to chroniclers like Jean Froissart, the executioners started by cutting off Hugh's genitals, throwing them into a fire before his eyes, a punishment chosen specifically to shame and symbolically punish his alleged sexual relationship with Edward II. The act was meant to be more than physical pain, it was moral mutilation, a statement. But they didn't stop there. While still alive and conscious, his abdomen was cut open, and his entrails were slowly pulled out and burned, one by one. The crowd watched as the former chamberlain, once feared, once untouchable, screamed in agony. His cries, it was said, were inhuman, echoing across the square like the wailing of a soul being dragged into hell. Some spectators wept, others cheered. Finally, after prolonged torture, Hugh was hanged by the neck. But even in death, his degradation was not complete. His head was severed and his body quartered, cut into 4 pieces, each sent to a different city in England. His head was displayed on a spike at the gate of London, a stark and bloody warning to any who dared to abuse royal power or defy the ruling order. It was not merely justice, it was theatrical vengeance. This brutal execution had layers of meaning. It avenged years of cruelty and greed. It symbolically purged the court of corruption, and, perhaps most importantly for Isabella and Mortimer, it erased a man who had stood between them and control of the realm. Hugh Despenser's name was now inseparable from tyranny and shame. But even in death, he had left his mark, not in legacy, but in fear. His body was gone. His story had just begun. The brutal death of Hugh Despenser the Younger marked not only the end of a man, but the collapse of a regime. A regime defined by greed, fear, and the unchecked power of royal favoritism. But even as his quartered body was scattered across England, the echoes of his influence and the reactions it provoked were far from over. Just weeks later, Edward II, stripped of his crown and dignity, was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, he was murdered under mysterious and disturbing circumstances. The most enduring legend, though debated by modern historians, claims he was killed with a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, a grotesque and symbolic mirror of the same accusations once hurled at Hugh. Whether true or not, the poetic cruelty of this method reveals more about the medieval imagination than the man himself. The regime that replaced them, led by Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, would not last. Though they had risen to power on the promise of justice, they soon mirrored the same arrogance and control they had once condemned. By 1330, the young Edward III had grown tired of their dominance. Mortimer was arrested, charged with treason, and hanged, though spared the tortures Hugh endured. Isabella was exiled from court, her power extinguished. The wheel of fortune had turned once more. But what remained was the memory, the story. For centuries, Hugh Despenser would be remembered as one of the most hated men in English history. In a modern survey, he was voted the greatest villain of the 14th century, even among the worst Britons of all time. In plays, novels, and television, he is often portrayed as the archetype of the corrupt courtier, manipulative, arrogant, and morally perverse. Yet modern historians have begun to question this image. While acknowledging his ruthless ambition and predatory greed, they also point out how accusations of sodomy were politically weaponized in the Middle Ages, a tool used to discredit enemies and justify unspeakable punishment. Was Hugh truly Edward's lover, or simply a convenient scapegoat in a world that feared any disruption of its social order? His execution was not just punishment, it was performance. A dark theater of pain, designed to restore balance, reinforce power, and cleanse the kingdom of imagined sin. And perhaps that is Hugh Despenser's greatest legacy. Not as a man of virtue or villainy, but as a symbol. A reflection of how power, sexuality, and politics collide, with devastating consequences, when fear outweighs reason and justice becomes spectacle. Nearly 700 years later, the story of Hugh Despenser still compels us, not just because of the horror of his death, but because of what it reveals about the brutality of history and the fragile line between influence and annihilation.